Welcome to Part 2 of Module 5.3, where we will explore more examples of climate change adaptation. Let's explore adaptation actions for the case studies that we talked about in Module 3. So let's check on Marta. Marta and her community have experienced a recent heat wave and low precipitation, which have lowered water levels and resulted in less energy from the Afobaca hydropower plant. Energy prices have increased and people are worried there may be a blackout. How would people adapt on the local level? To adapt to the heat wave and potential energy insecurity, Marta takes measures to use less energy in her house by turning off lights and minimizing electricity use. Marta learns how to be more energy efficient and how her community can diversify their energy sources, for example, using wind or solar energy. The community discusses ways to proactively reduce their energy consumption and increase energy efficiency if an event like this happens again in the future. The community also discusses ways to stay cool outdoors. For example, people could visit a Cola Creek, Lakawacha, or a pool, and parents could look for ways to implement small or little yard swimming pools for kids to use outdoors. What about adaptation on a national level? The government of Suriname and other state actors have taken actions to help understand the impacts of climate change on the energy sector. Some examples include a project to strengthen energy efficiency policy and regulation, increasing staff's technical capacities at EBS, and EBS is also working to modernize its generation and transmission capacity, including in rural and hinterland areas. The government of Suriname's National Adaptation Plan has a priority focused on energy, and this priority is continuing to research energy gaps in the sector, as well as to improve data and data analysis for the use in policy development. The government is implementing awareness and capacity building programs to encourage training of new professionals in energy research and development. And they're working to implement financial incentives to influence energy use and to decrease emissions. Let's check on Michael. A recent storm event has damaged buildings, houses, and telephone poles in Michael's community. What would local adaptation look like? After learning that Michael's family is safe, he focuses on his flooded home. He does not want it to become more damaged or to become moldy in the humid conditions. He assesses the damage and makes repairs where possible, and he also works on flood-proofing his house by sealing cracks and openings to minimize water infiltration and by adding waterproof coating to the walls and floors. Michael also puts his electronic devices and furniture on a higher platform for the rest of the rainy season. He thinks about moving his family away from the coast as he is worried his house will continue to flood in the future. What would adaptation look like on the national level? The government of Suriname and other state actors have taken actions to understand the impact of climate change on infrastructure. Some examples include developing a disaster risk financing and insurance framework, implementing new build infrastructure projects, including a new ring dike and ring canal, updating building codes and regulations to ensure building material is climate resilient. The government of Suriname's National Adaptation Plan prioritizes infrastructure and housing and involves enhancing infrastructure and housing information and data for decision making, designing and implementing regulation standards and guidelines, and building capacity in the infrastructure sector by improving skills, training, and expertise. Let's check on Lando. A heavy rainy season has damaged road and marine transportation networks in his community. This has impacted Lando's community as they require marine transportation to receive essential goods and services, including food and fuel for their diesel generators. How would they adapt on a local level? Lando and other community members wait for the water levels to decrease and then begin to repair damaged transportation infrastructure, including the port and roads. To deal with the potential energy insecurity, Lando's community coordinates with a diesel resupplier and is able to have the fuel shipment expedited. The community discusses how they could safely store more fuel and/or find alternative off-grid energy options in case this happens again. What about adaptation on the national level? The government of Suriname has included transportation priorities in the National Adaptation Plan under infrastructure and housing. Objectives focus on coordinating infrastructure and housing efforts in transportation and capital projects and linking climate change to demographic, health, and transportation planning. Let's check on Joyce. Continued sea level rise and higher waves have resulted in increased saltwater intrusion in her freshwater resources, which have impacted her ability to irrigate rice crop. What would local adaptation look like? Joyce decides to improve her existing irrigation methods and build additional water storage to collect rainwater and protect freshwater from saltwater intrusion. Joyce also decides that next season she will try to diversify their rice by planting a more drought-tolerant variety so that it requires less water. Joyce and other rice farmers in her community gather to discuss the issues they are facing and to share ways they are mitigating the saltwater intrusion and increased rice production costs. What about national adaptation? The government of Suriname and other state actors are taking actions to understand the impacts of climate change to the agricultural sector. Examples include research on climate resilient crops, including crops that are resistant to diseases, insects, and droughts, and that may increase in production as a result of climate change. Suriname is rich in freshwater resources, and so another adaptation could be increasing irrigation capacity to improve resilience against drought. The government of Suriname's National Adaptation Plan includes priorities related to agriculture, livestock, and fisheries. Specific initiatives focus on a comprehensive national research program, again on climate resilient crops, as well as agricultural practices, animal husbandry, and fisheries, integrating climate resilience into agricultural services, developing a sustainable agriculture policy, including relevant climate resilience mechanisms for existing and new regulations, and providing financial support for farmers, pastoralists, and fisherfolk. Let's check on Jose. A recent heavy precipitation event has resulted in widespread flooding of the rivers and nearby communities. This has overwhelmed and damaged his community's water infrastructure and led to water contamination. Local adaptation has involved Jose and members of his community trying to repair the rainwater collection and surface water storage infrastructure and equipment. They also relocate them to higher ground away from the floods. Jose's youngest child has recovered from drinking the contaminated water, but the water is still contaminated and people must buy expensive bottled water for cooking and drinking. The community discusses ways to improve their sources of drinking water to reduce future risk. They decide to advocate to the government to increase their piped water infrastructure. What about adaptation on a national scale? The government of Suriname and other state actors have taken actions to help understand the impacts of climate change to the water sector. So some examples of this include the government developing a roadmap for integrated water resource management and organizing public workshops and debates to promote integrated water resource management. The government of Suriname has also prioritized water in their National Adaptation Plan, and specific initiatives focus on policies and regulations that ensure sustainable use of drinking water resources and wastewater management, implementing climate resilient infrastructure updates and developments to ensure the availability of safe drinking water, and using mangroves and coastal ecosystems to help build climate resilience for water resources. Finally, let's check on Sandra. The Biggie Pond area has experienced an annual increase in temperature, drought conditions, sea level rise, wave action, and more forest fires over the past 20 years. This has resulted in gradual degradation of the natural coastal ecosystem. What would local adaptation look like in this case? Sandra decides she needs to act on the degrading coastal forestry ecosystem. She takes a course on coastal zone management to learn more about how the coast can be managed to promote climate resilience and biodiversity. She begins talking to other people in the community to raise awareness about the impacts of climate change on the ecosystem and ways they can help protect the coastal ecosystem by leaving the area undisturbed, reporting invasive species, and supporting organizations who are working to restore biodiversity. Sandra also flood-proofs her house and contacts local politicians to discuss ways to diversify the Biggie Pond economy if tourism continues to decline. What about national adaptation? The government of Suriname and other state actors are taking actions to understand the impacts of climate change on the forestry sector. Some examples include a draft Coastal Protection Act, which has been developed and submitted to Parliament and would benefit mangrove conservation, utilizing local knowledge of forests and their sustainable use and management, establishing a legally protected area on the coast to ensure adequate management and use, including in the context of climate change. The government of Suriname's National Adaptation Plan is prioritizing sustainable forestry management by awareness raising and capacity building related to forestry management and forest carbon accounting, as well as managing mangroves and coastal forest resources in a climate resilient way, and developing and implementing governance and finance regimes to incorporate climate resilience in the forestry sector of Suriname. Before we finish our discussion on adaptation, I want to highlight the concept of adaptation pathways, which is often used for adaptation planning in infrastructure. An adaptation pathway is a decision-making strategy that is made up of a sequence of manageable steps or decision points over time. An adaptation pathways approach to adaptation planning is about keeping options open and avoiding being locked into just one single path. Adaptation pathways also mean that you don't necessarily need to implement the biggest or the best strategy, but that you do your best to adapt and leave options open for revision in the future. So this figure provides a great example of adaptation pathways. As you can see, there are multiple different pathways that someone could take. And at different points in time, so if this is time, at different points in time, you may reach a decision point. Usually this is triggered by some sort of environmental or social change. And at this decision point, people maybe get together and reassess adaptation, and you can go, again, multiple different ways. People at this decision point may ask, what are the plausible futures that we are now looking at? What is the risk we are willing to accept? And what tools and resources are we now working with? This decision leads to the next stage of the adaptation pathway until another decision point is triggered. The adaptation pathways approach is beneficial because it allows flexibility and iterative decision making, where you can use the knowledge and tools available at the decision point to move forward in the best way possible. As long as you stay in this adaptive space, which is in the white here, there is really no right or wrong way to adapt.